President Trump on the verge of a much-needed policy win. The House is set to hold a historic vote today on the GOP plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. Let's talk about this. For more, we're joined by CNBC contributor Jared Bernstein and Michael Barnes, a former drug and healthcare policy advisor to President Bush. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So, Mike, after 7 years of Republicans promising this and voting on it, looks like it's set to happen today. How big of a win will it be for House leadership and for President Trump if it goes through?
I think it's a short-term win at best for House leadership and for President Trump because of the content of this bill. It's a real boon to the insurers, I have to say that. But as it relates to the constituencies that voted these members of Congress and the president into office, a lot of the protections that are available to them through the Affordable Care Act are going to be gutted or could be gutted by this particular law. For example, charging more for pre-existing conditions, getting rid of the requirement of essential health benefits that protects people who have addiction, for example, or provides maternity care. And then the annual limits as well as the lifetime limits, those coverage protections for consumers could be eliminated. And ultimately, it's going to come back to the people who voted for these members of Congress and the president to say, what did you do to our health care?
But you know the answer to that, Jared. They'll say we lowered the premiums and we got rid of a system that was collapsing within its own weight just in the last 24 hours. Aetna pulling out of the Virginia exchange.
That's going to be a very tough sell for these politicians if some of the predictions that you just heard from Michael come true, and I suspect they will. And by the way, it's not just Michael. The Congressional Budget Office tells us that this plan, which by the way is just an extension of the earlier version, over 20 million people will lose health care, and premiums are supposed to go up under this plan for older people, for people with moderate incomes, and now for people with pre-existing conditions. So this takes us back to some really big problems that loom large before Obamacare came into effect. So yes, I do think, and it's going to take a while, if they're successful, and by the way, the Senate stands between them and success right now, so that's a big deal. But if they're able to get this legislation in place and really repeal Obamacare and replace it with this much less favorable plan from consumers' perspective, they're going to have a lot to answer for and account for.
Hey, Michael, the Post is saying that the CBO is informing Democrats that a score could come as early as next week. Do we really believe the vote would be materially different once the score came out?
I do think it could be materially different because we know that these members of Congress then are going to see the real impact on their districts, and that could have the same sort of influence that it had back in March when they realized that they could be in trouble at the ballot boxes come a year and a half from now because of this particular vote. So waiting for the CBO would be a smart move, but I don't think politically it makes sense for the Republicans because it's not going to be favorable to them in this bill.
Yeah, let me hitchhike off that for a second. One of the main reasons a score would be unfavorable to them, I mean, basically facts don't help these people, is because it would show that this high-risk pool idea, which is what they propose to do for people with pre-existing conditions who will face skyrocketing premiums, is deeply underfunded, probably by around $200 billion. And that really kind of shows the lie of this Republican kind of assurance that's bringing the congressional moderates on board that, don't worry, we're taking care of the people with pre-existing conditions who were, covered under Obamacare.
Well, Michael, there was this argument in January, can we repeal without replacing it with something viable? They seem to have decided we got to replace it, but might we in fact be back there? The biggest plus here is that it's a repeal. Maybe the replacement itself is going to have to go through a whole lot of amendments. It won't end up actually looking like this when they're done.
Well, the better approach would have been just to reform the Affordable Care Act and do a lot of things that should have been done back in 2010 to protect consumers from the insurance companies that are exploiting them. But in reality, some of the things that are in this bill could have been useful at stabilizing the exchange market, which is the primary reason for the repeal. For example, the pricing ratio between younger people and older people, that could make a difference in the exchanges to allow some of the more nimble, newer insurance companies to go in and thrive. Centene Corp is one that comes on often to CNBC, and they say that they can do it, right? But these the overall notion of repeal is going to be disastrous for consumers, and ultimately it's going to be really difficult for them to justify a vote in favor of it.
So, Jared, like it or hate it, let's move on. Does it make the prospects of tax reform getting done more realistic, and does it bring that forward?
I don't know about that. I mean, I think the thing I would say about tax reform is that underlying all of this, it's funny that we've sort of lost this thread, is actually a very big tax cut, particularly for those at the top of the scale, because the Affordable Care Act, remember, they're cutting $1 trillion of spending on the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act is funded by progressive taxation, so if you cut the Affordable Care Act, wealthy people get a very big tax cut already. And in fact, that was kind of part of the two-step that I think Republican tax cutters wanted to commit. Now, I don't know that this makes tax, quote, reform any easier, because there is no real tax reform plan. There's this kind of one-pager with 200 words of tax cuts. That's a heavy lift.
Well, they have to work on it. That was from the administration, and now they have to work on it when they get back from recess. And maybe at least they can show they can pass legislation.
I think it probably makes it harder in the following sense. If the Senate now has to spend 2 months arguing about health care, which may be what we're looking at, I don't see how that helps the tax reform effort much at all.
Well, we're going to continue that conversation when Congress gets back from recess. But for now, gentlemen, thank you. Jared Bernstein
Thank you.
And Michael Barnes as we await that historic vote, Carl, this afternoon.